Hello, everyone. My name is Kyle Matthews. I'm Executive Director of the Montreal Institute for Genocide and Human Rights Studies. We're pleased to welcome you to Day 3 of Right City. This year's conference is focused on human rights in the digital age. And we're really pleased today to have two really important sessions, one on Can Democracies Unite on Tech to Fight Authoritarian Regimes, and another one on the use of social media to prosecute people for committing mass atrocity crimes. So we have two really fascinating sessions. Just like to thank all of our partners that made this possible. On behalf of my colleagues at the Montreal Institute for Genocide and Human Rights Studies, we're one of the main organizers with the Raoul Wallenberg Center for Human Rights. But this year we also have the support of the Canadian Department of National Defence through their Targeted Engagement Program. We have support of the Center for Research and Education on Human Rights at the University of Ottawa. We have the support of the U.S. Embassy to Canada, as well as the Embassy of the Kingdom of the Netherlands to Canada. As well as the international organization Global Action Against Mass Atrocity Crimes, and also the Canadian Commission to UNESCO. So we have a really kind of interesting group of organizations and diplomatic representations that are sponsoring this event. So with that to do, I'd like to pass the floor to Colin of the Canadian Global Affairs Institute. Colin, the floor is yours. You can introduce the speakers and facilitate the discussion. Thank you.
Perfect. Well, thanks, Kyle. Well, as Kyle said, I'm Colin Robertson, and I'm Vice President and Fellow at the Canadian Global Affairs Institute. And I want to welcome you all to this panel on democracies and technology. And I'm particularly delighted to welcome our panelists, Kristin Lord, Chris Walker, and Thorsten Benner. Chris Walker is Vice President of Studies and Analysis at the National Endowment for Democracy based in Washington. Kristin Lord is President and CEO of IREX, a global development and education organization also based in Washington. Thorsten Benner is co-founder and director of the Global Public Policy, an independent nonprofit think tank based in Berlin. Their mission is to improve global governance through research, policy advice, and debate. Chris and Kristen join us from DC, and Thorsten is in Berlin. I'm in Ottawa. Kyle Matthews, who will manage your questions at about the 45-minute mark, so do use that cue function, is in Montreal. A bit of context for our audience. At the Munich Security Conference in February, President Joe Biden said, "We must shape the rules that will govern the advance of technologies and the norms of behavior in cyberspace, artificial intelligence, biotechnology, so that they are used to lift people up, not used to pin them down." This comes amid talks from the Biden administration and others for a Western Tech Democracy Alliance, as more and more Western democracies are waking up to the challenge of authoritarian tech and human rights. Leaders in countries including Cuba, Iran, North Korea, Russia, and Venezuela are increasingly using technology for liberal ends. As we've seen in the disinformation campaigns against the Hong Kong activists, current in the news today, following the anti-extradition protest in 2019 by China, espionage of Iranian activists, and hiring Twitter's employees to spy on Saudi activists by Saudi Arabia. At the NATO and G7 summits this past week, there was reference to the challenge that technology utilized to interfere in elections or as a channel for disinformation using social media and other vehicles. NATO is going to update its strategic concept in part because of the challenge of emerging disruptive technologies. So let's get started. Thorsten, I'll start with you as you come from farthest away, although not by cyberway. Since you're based in Germany, do you have any perspectives on what Germany or other European countries are doing or should be doing to address these big issues? Thorsten.
Thank you, Colin, and thank you, Kyle, for the invitation. And it's great to be with Kristin and Chris on this excellent panel on an important topic. Maybe for starters, I'll share my personal perspective, which I don't claim is any particular German or European perspective on this. I think the discussion on authoritarian tech is absolutely important, but it's also important that we actually keep perspective. First of all, that we see the proportions. Our democracies, they will not fail because of authoritarian tech. They will fail because actors in our democracy will use technology for liberal ends. What Prime Minister Orban has done in Hungary, building this illiberal state, the way he calls it himself, or what President Trump did in the US, they didn't use authoritarian tech in the sense that this is technology that comes from authoritarian countries, but they use technology for liberal ends, but that's our technology in democracy. So I think it's important to keep perspective in this whole game. And I just like to make two recommendations in terms of how we can move forward. On the one hand, I think it's important to have a defensive agenda. That means that our companies, we should make sure that they don't become complicit in repression in authoritarian regimes. You've listed in the introduction a number of examples where companies from democracies have enabled transnational repression or repression in authoritarian countries. For example, the companies, Western companies providing the swabs for genetic sampling in Xinjiang and the like. So we need to make sure that our companies are not complicit in repression, authoritarian repression. And that probably means, especially for kind of social media companies, that it will be very hard for them to be in aggressive authoritarian systems. And at the same time, I think we need to make sure that those who fled from repression in authoritarian systems and are now in our democracies, that we protect them from the long arm of authoritarianism and authoritarian tech, be that of President Putin or Erdogan, the Saudi regime, or China. And I think we have a lot of work to do on that front, because all too often activists are subject to transnational repression by these governments, and we don't do enough to protect them. And at the same time, I think it's important to use technology to uncover repression. I think we've done that quite successfully. Much of the evidence on Xinjiang has kind of come out of the intelligent use of technology, and I think we can also use it as a support for litigating mass atrocity crimes and so on. So I think we can use it positively. So there's a big case for kind of democracies coming together against authoritarian tech, but I would like to say that there's at least equally big a case for democracies to come together for democratic tech, because it shouldn't just be a defensive agenda where we kind of the main concern is with fending off authoritarian technology produced by and used by authoritarian countries. But I think we need to make sure that we use technology here in order to kind of support democracy and social justice. What you said in the beginning, that quote of President Biden at the Munich Security Conference, where the technology is used to lift people up, not to pin them down. I think the way that story turns out in our societies, that's mostly and totally in our hands. And I think we should think more along the lines of the likes of Ethan Zuckerman of MIT. A few years ago, he wrote a kind of an optimistic piece, or at least an aspirational piece, 6 or 7 ways that social media can enable democracy, and think along these lines, because I think we can only kind of be competitive in the competition of systems with authoritarian state capitalism if we ourselves make sure that technology doesn't weaken and undermine democracy at home, but that it strengthens democracy. So fortifying this at home and using technology for and learning to use technology for democratic ends, I think, is an important kind of part of our agenda.
Well, thanks, Thorsten. I take your point, and I hadn't thought about that, about asylum policy relating to the use of this as well. It's something that Western governments should think about. And of course, as you point out, tech used for both good and bad. Well, Kristen, let me move to you and tell us a bit about IREX. You do a fair bit of work in capacity building leaders and institutions. Can you tell us a bit more about this work and what can be done to bolster the privacy and security of civil society groups that are being threatened?
Yes, thank you very much, Colin. It's a real delight to be here with all of you today. So to put our work in some kind of context, I think when we're thinking about authoritarian technology and how to respond, as Torsten was talking about, not just defensively, but maybe more proactively, there are a number of places we can think about intervening. One is at the level of domestic or international policy. One is at the level of the tech platforms. But IREX really is working with individuals, individual activists, individual human rights advocates, and so on, and also at the level of civil society organizations. And I think that's an area where there are actually huge asymmetries, I'd even say inequities, between civil society organizations and their ability to protect themselves, to defend themselves. And I just want to make a couple of points about some of the things we've learned through this kind of work. One of them is that, we really need to think about this work as not just being one-off trainings. Trainings are useful. You can teach people and their organizations how to protect themselves better. But the landscape is changing so quickly, the tools are changing so quickly that we find it is much more effective to think about this as an ongoing form of support, an ongoing form of partnership. So that's one thing. I think it's especially useful if there are maybe hubs or resources set up that can serve a number of smaller organizations all at once, so that they're sort of constantly available as threats emerge. And again, to have that constant vigilance as things change. Another point I want to make is that we see a huge value in networking these organizations with each other. They really rely on each other, not just to share expertise, technical ideas, lessons learned, and so on, but also really to form some sense of solidarity. People who are engaged in this kind of work, these kinds of campaigns it's a very stressful activity. They feel a lot of emotional support when they band together. And so one thing that I, as an individual, have learned from our team and doing this work is that one of the most important things that we do to protect civil society organizations and individual activists is to provide psychosocial support. If they are able to protect their own psychosocial health, they are in a much better position to continue with their important work and continue protecting others. So it's that kind of unexpected human side that we need to not forget when we're focusing on technology and technological threats.
And Kristen, that's a very good point, I think, about groups like this, or yours and others, working together. To me, that's the great advantage that democracies have over the authoritarians. I recall I was at the Seoul Defense Dialogue a couple of years ago, prior to the pandemic, and I had dinner with a PLA colonel. And he, after a few drinks, he made the point that the one thing that the Chinese really did admire the United States for, but also feared, was its alliance system and the fact that our civil societies across nations work together. Not the same for authoritarians. So I think that's a very good point you make. Christopher, let me move to you. You testified recently on the threat of sharp power to the integrity of democracies. Could you tell us a bit about what sharp power is in your terms and how democratic systems could safeguard against it?
So first of all, Colin, thank you so much for the invitation. It's great to be here with you and also with Kristen and Torsten. I think I'd answer the question in the following way with some context. I think if we think about where we are today in the struggle for democracy and global politics, we're 15 years into a democratic decline. But I would argue that the companion component to that is also a period of time of authoritarian resurgence. And interestingly, if you use the start date of the mid-2000s, which is Freedom House's assessment, it's also when the technological revolution took off. So Twitter, Facebook, and YouTube all came on the scene in earnest at that time. And I think we have to reckon with the impact of the technological revolution. On the one hand, this has offered authoritarian regimes to have the sort of reach that I think few really anticipated, certainly going back 20 or 25 years ago in the lead up to what has now become the period of democratic decline. At the same time, as Torsten alluded to, I think democracies have really struggled to build norms around the technologies in ways that are consistent with democratic accountability, transparency, and human rights. And that's a very bad combination, where you have ambitious authoritarian regimes on the one hand, who, after all, have a point of view. They have a preference. They do not privilege free association or freedom of expression. On the contrary, one only needs to look at the way in which the regime in Beijing treats its own citizens or those in, for example, Hong Kong to get a flavor of their approach to these things. And likewise in Russia, freedom of expression is repressed fiercely there by the authorities in the country. And so it's not really a surprise that when they reach beyond their borders, they take that sensibility with them. And when it comes to that sort of interaction beyond their borders, what my colleagues and I have found, and this is true in a report that we've released today, which has updated some of our research on these issues, is that in many cases, what we find is the effects of the engagement from China, its government, and its surrogates has the effect of encouraging censorship or otherwise sidelining debate on certain issues, or enhancing or baking in surveillance when it comes to the tech side of things. I think the key issue here is for the democracies, it's really up to them in the end, for us, to develop approaches that can defend essential values. We can't expect that, for example, the authorities in China, who face no real pressure domestically to change, who have very clear visions for how these things should be organized, not only in terms of governance domestically, but increasingly in key rule-setting bodies, whether it's within the UN or elsewhere when it comes to technology standards. They will pursue those interests in the absence of any sort of check on their power, which means it's actually up to the democracies, as we say in the report we released today, to stimulate a race to the top and to make certain that democratic values animate and surround technology, both for our own society's health, but I think also for the larger struggle that's emerged, including in countries that are deciding what path they're going to take and really do have a choice as to whether it will be more in the direction of more surveillance and censorship baked into the technology, or whether it will be a path that privileges and respects privacy, openness, transparency, and freedom of expression.
Thanks, Chris. Do you want to just tell us the title of that report? We'll put it in the comments side and we'll do a hyperlink to it, but if people want to sort of access it while listening, what's it called? And it's on the NEP website. Correct.
It's called A Full Spectrum Response to Sharp Power, the Vulnerabilities and Strengths of Open Societies. And this is a follow-on report and an outgrowth of a report that we released in December 2017 on this topic.
Okay, thank you. Thorsten, let me move to you again. How should, Chris has talked about sharp power, how should the democratic governments respond to these sort of attacks by authoritarian regimes, including individually, although as I think Chris makes, we'd be far better if we could act collectively. Thorsten?
I think we need to, I mean, that's where this democracy, alliance of democracies, I think really comes in. I do think in order to deter the kind of censorship demands, I think we need solidarity and collective actions, including the use, for example, of hostage taking by Beijing. Remember my think tank colleague, Canadian diplomat Michael Kovrig, who has been lingering in a Chinese prison for over 2 years to put pressure on the Canadian government. I think we need collective security mechanisms and real solidarity to stand together against these kind of transnational forms of repression. You mentioned kind of attacks on democracy. I think, as I said before, a lot of the fight for our democracy will be won by kind of working within our own public, and that's the key front. But the kind of external front and dealing with nefarious interference, I think is an important concern. I think the most important point is to make sure that we fortify the core institutions of our democracies in the electoral system against interference, that we educate our publics and don't get surprised if it happens. I think that's a big part of the answer, and we kind of need to make what's being done in election campaigns in terms of digital advertising and so on a lot more transparent mandatorily. And I think we still haven't, we're moving into a German election season where we have, for every political party and political actor, there's so many requirements for every dime that you spend that you kind of have proof to it to the authorities. But there's very little accountability schemes or like due diligence on the kind of data you use and the way you do political advertising. And I think that would be equally important. I think Chris made, let me respond to one important point that Chris makes. I think his sharp power concept is an important contribution to the debate, but it shouldn't detract from the fact that a lot of what authoritarian players are doing is not through the back door necessarily, and it's using very, very simple tools of just buying enablers in our societies, within our professional elites, within our media elites, within our public relations lobbying elites, within our kind of other professional legal elites to advance their kind of authoritarian agenda using these enablers. So I think what I think is absolutely critical is that we need mandatory transparency requirements for any business relationship with authoritarian players, that lobbyists, PR firms, academics, think tanks, and the like have. I think we need to use the power of transparency. That's a cornerstone of our democracy in response to the authoritarian kind of interference efforts. We shouldn't become authoritarian ourselves, but we should use the power of transparency in our own systems and scandalize the selling out of those enablers. And I think that's a key part of the answer from my vantage point.
No, thanks. I certainly agree with you on the transparency side. And I also thank you for raising the plight of Michael Kovrig, former colleague in the Foreign Service, who's approaching 1,000 days now in sort of Chinese jail. And it's something that, as you point out, the Western world has to keep its focus on this kind of abuses of human rights. Otherwise, these poor people are going to be just forgotten. Kristen, let me turn to you. President Biden has talked about the democracies coming together. The idea of a tech democratic alliance, what would it look like, and how would you kind of get it together? Would you see President Biden convening a kind of summit like he did recently around climate? How is this going to, because I do think this is important, how's it going to come together? And I guess you've been giving some thinking to it.
Well, I think, Colin, that President Biden is already intending to pull together a democracy summit. It's something he talked about early in his campaign, and I know the White House is working actively to put that together. And there are a lot of elements of that. I think they're looking at the technology thread that's being discussed in this panel. I think they're thinking about how to weave together the domestic focus and the international focus. And I hope, and I understand there'll also be some focus to the level of individual citizens and the issue of disinformation, which I'm going to talk about a bit because I know we were discussing it right before the session started. And on that issue of disinformation, which I think is such a toxic, corrosive factor in democracies right now, I do think that that's something I would love to see President Biden, the other leaders in our democratic allies take very seriously. And that has to be on a number of fronts. It needs to be at the level of policy. We do need to think about how we can weed out as much as we can using technological solutions and in partnership with tech platforms. But also, as we were discussing earlier, I strongly believe we need to look at the level of individual citizens and making sure that they are more resilient to disinformation when the cost of producing disinformation is basically zero. and we live in democratic societies, things will always get through the net. And so I think we need to look to our democratic allies, we in the United States, to countries like Sweden, like Ukraine, that have been much more effective at building this type of resilience in their citizens, in integrating media literacy into school curricula. Finland is another great example. I think we need to learn that lesson, and we need to work to integrate that much more systematically, again, through school systems, but also reaching older populations through libraries and other means. If we want to have an alliance of democracies, I think we have to hit all these fronts at once.
No, I think that's right about both media literacy as well as education in the schools. I recently worked on a disinformation study, and that was certainly one thing that came clear to us, that the key role of, as you put it, literacy, but also education. So I think that is something that would have to happen in this kind of idea of an alliance. Christopher, let me turn to you, because there would be disparate interests in such an alliance. How realistic is it, and how do you guarantee that members go beyond just the declarations and actually implement the kind of programs that Kristen just talked about?
So thanks for that question, Colin. I'm going to amplify a couple of things that Kristen just alluded to. I think the speed and complexity with which the modern technological resources have hit all of us really presents an extraordinary burden for any single citizen to shoulder. And for those reasons, both at the governmental level, but I would contend at the civil society level, there really are enormous opportunities and responsibilities to help ordinary citizens navigate this new terrain, whether we're talking about day-to-day usages of information, not sharing inadvertently disinformation, and the like, or understanding the larger policy issues, which frankly are so complicated, it just makes my head spin. And I think to the extent we can devise ways for civil society to play a more meaningful role, to serve as a translator and an educator, it's very important. To your question, I think part of this is really an opportunity, given the fact that the tech challenge is hitting so many disparate democracies. There's no single democracy that I'm aware of that's escaped any of the challenges that have emerged. Some may be dealing with them a little bit better than others, but the fact of the matter is we're all struggling to figure out ways to make the information landscape, the technological landscape, more user-friendly in a democracy context. And I think in that regard, there really are important opportunities to share information across countries and regions, to use civil society in that regard, to help accelerate learning, say in certain places where a country or a sector in a country may be more advanced, with those that are a little bit behind. Kristen alluded to some of the countries that have really been ahead of the curve, in part because they've been stimulated by Russian disinformation. Places like Ukraine and the Baltic states have been on the front lines of these things for ages and are very adept at developing responses. I think we need to do more to find ways to make sure that democracies of all stripes are working together, collaborating to accelerate learning and get better outcomes.
Chris, how do we do that? Do we do that, like, does this become like a standing item at a G7 summit, or if we create a kind of a tech alliance, would you see that? Because I think collectively there has to be some effort. Or do you do it within NATO? The European Union has, I think, pretty good, they do some good work on disinformation. The country that really has impressed me with what they've done, aside from the Baltic states, is Taiwan.
So I would approach this by, rather than thinking about the precise modality at the outset, to think about what the key overarching objectives would be. And I think this is particularly important in this domain because the tech challenges are changing so rapidly. You need some sort of resource or mechanism that's capable of adapting quickly to meet the new challenges. And so I wouldn't plant the flag on any single governmental entity per se, or even a single NGO entity per se. But I do think if we believe that this needs to happen, and that there needs to be a flexible mechanism that would allow democracies to meaningfully engage and respond to these issues, then you could, I would think, find a way to do this that includes both the non-governmental and the governmental sector at some level. But I would be reluctant to say it needs to be some precise governmental mechanism, which might be important, but in this context, insufficient.
Okay. Kristen, let me come back to you then, because I know IREX has done work to increase capacity of civilians and sort of ordinary people to be more resilient to disinformation campaigns. Do you want to speak a little bit more about the examples? Now, you've used European examples, but is there good work being done in the United States or in the Americas?
The short answer is yes, but it's not nearly enough. So let me back up just a second. We know that media literacy, you can call it digital literacy, cyber citizenship, media literacy, you can call it different things, but we actually know that it works. I believe one of your colleagues pasted in the chat an article I published recently with a colleague, and we tried to link to a lot of the research out there. And it's not just about teaching people how to check facts, or even, as Chris rightly pointed out, just read things before you forward them, because a shocking percentage of people forward messages and articles on social media without clicking on the links. But it's also about recognizing emotional manipulation, because this is how a lot of misinformation and disinformation gets spread. It's playing to aspects of people's identity, playing to people's fear. And we have good research that shows if you teach people to recognize that and not to share in a knee-jerk sort of fashion, that it does change their behavior. And you can see on our IREX website, we have some research showing that even a year and a half after a fairly minimal level of training, we still see a significant change of behavior where people no longer forward such information to such a degree. So that's the first thing. We absolutely know that this works. And you can do it by giving individuals the skills, but ideally you would have a more systemic response. And so Ukraine is an example where IREX is really proud to work in partnership with the government of the UK and also with the US Embassy in Ukraine to provide some support to the the Ministry of Education in Ukraine. And what Ukraine has done is basically integrate media literacy across its curriculum. It's not a separate subject, it's not an add-on. They just work it into science, social studies, history, and so on. It's very, very effective. And I gave other examples. That's not the only way to do media literacy. We have examples working in the United States through libraries. IREX works in Indonesia, in Jordan, and many other countries. There are a number of other NGOs who also do this work. The problem is that, frankly, the scale is just way out of whack with the scale of the problem. This is much talked about, this intervention. In fact, a new RAND study came out along with a Carnegie study saying that media literacy is one of the most frequently mentioned interventions to deal with disinformation. But in terms of coordinated action, in terms of resources, it's really minuscule. So I'll make one more point because I could elaborate at length here. But to answer the question you posed to Chris about how would we coordinate, sure, of course we would want to put this issue on meetings at the G7, for instance, regular meetings in bilateral fora, but I think we also need leadership from government domestically, and also we need support and coordination for civil society to play a role. Maybe the National Endowment for Democracy, since Chris is on the call, can take this on in the US, but there are many others that could as well. We don't have good clearinghouses for resources that teach media literacy to different audiences. We don't have great research on what works the best. There's so much that could be done to network these different groups together and just to provide better quality information to those who want to take this on. It's not very expensive. We know it works. And I think it's time we just had some leadership, some investment, and some coordination.
Coordination, I think, is the key word. Particularly, that's where I think the democracies have an advantage, because we've got all these existing institutions to actually coordinate. Thorsten, can democratic governments use existing rules? We've talked about what should be, but do we not have existing rules that we can apply in terms of corporate responsibility and due diligence to ensure that technology is not weaponized?
I do think we should use our human rights standards that we have as part of domestic and international law in order to demand that companies comply with that. In Germany, we just passed the so-called supply chain law that mandates due diligence requirements to all German companies in terms of making sure that no human rights are being violated all the way through the supply chain. I'm a big fan the way you do it in practice and so on. I think there's discussions on how to do it most effectively, but I'm generally very much a fan of clear rules and transparency standards, and I'm not a fan at all of this woolly corporate social responsibility approach. We need clear rules and standards, and that's one way to approach this. Let me just add one thought on the kind of alliance for Summit for Democracy that we just talked about. I have two things. On the one hand, I think we need to make sure at a leaders level and government level that there's a collective security mechanism against political and economic coercion by authoritarian players, and that democracies come and that states at the receiving end of this come together and so on. The Summit for Democracy, though, I don't necessarily, the Biden idea, I don't think it would be very strong at a leaders level. Just imagine all the debates should the Indian Prime Minister be invited or not. All these countries that are somehow on the fence right now. We'll have endless debates on who is a democracy or not. I think we should use this Summit for Democracy not to just have a stale old format of leaders meeting, but as a summit for, as Chris said, mutual learning, and to amplify pro-democracy voices from all different parts of our societies, be them also from academia, who stand up for academic freedom against authoritarian repression threats, from the media and from other parts of civil society. And I think that would send a powerful signal, and a much stronger signal than just having a leaders summit.
Which takes me to civil society and their role. Christopher, let me ask you about this, because I know the National Endowment for Democracy does an awful lot of work with civil societies as a kind of healthy, vital pillar to democracy. How can they contribute if we're going to create this kind of a global alliance? Is that where it has to, does it really have to come from civil society to government?
I think it's a terribly important component, in essence, because civil society in open societies are the sorts of groups and people and institutions that are swinging away on a daily basis to try to get officialdom to do the right thing, to try to get the corporate sector to upgrade their own approach to these things in ways that are more transparent and accountable and consistent with democratic practice. And we have a lot of work to do in that space. I think as you move across the spectrum into countries that may not have as much space, civil society is under great duress in these places. Paradoxically, in part because they may be surveilled more in the way that Torsten alluded to at the outset, both within those countries and increasingly beyond their borders. Ron Diebert and his colleagues at Citizen Lab at the University of Toronto have done brilliant work on this and really have been at the forefront of the effort to understand these things. So I think if we're going to succeed over time, it's hard to imagine civil society not playing a meaningful role, both in the context of helping to shape the rules that are being discussed at the supranational level, for example, but also at the national level in a governmental context. And then coming back to a point I made earlier, and which I think Kristen has made very eloquently, it's hard to imagine that citizens in democratic societies can get their bearings in the absence of meaningful civil society education efforts and other efforts to help people understand these very complex issues that are emerging in the tech sphere. So I can't stress enough the role of civil society to help us be successful in this challenge.
Chris, now you do most of your work abroad, and good work abroad, but one of the things that struck me listening to Tony Blinken and Jake Sullivan over the years is that they say that democracies have first got to get their act together at home and then help fellow democracies, and then the next step would be emerging democracies or those where democracies are in trouble. So if you start at home, that means the United States. I know that's sort of beyond your remit, but do you see that's where it also has to start? Because certainly the last few years have demonstrated that even established democracies are at risk of disinformation and misuse of tech.
And even established democracies are vulnerable to problems well beyond the two you just alluded to in waves we've seen in recent years. The points that we stressed in the report we released today, and I just mentioned two of them that are directly relevant to your question, Colin. One is democracies and autocracies are tethered in ways that many of us didn't anticipate. And often that interaction redounds poorly in the democratic context. And it doesn't mean that this is solely the impact of the autocracies, as I think Torsten rightly made the point at the outset of this discussion. But it does mean the interactions that are so comprehensive now have to be thought about differently, given the interconnections that are there. And then critically, in my view, I think while it's true that democracies, including the United States, need to get their own house in order, they can't do so by ignoring the world around them, because the problems that emanate from beyond their borders, on the one hand, are not going to stop. There's no pause button that's going to be hit. These problems have to be addressed simultaneously with the domestic problems. And beyond that, furthermore, to the extent we are going to learn from partners, say, in different parts of Europe or in Africa or in Latin America or Asia, as we upgrade and accelerate our own capacities, that's not going to happen by closing the door and just figuring out how to fix things at home. I think we're past that point. So I would really stress this notion of learning in partnership. And I think it feeds back into earlier parts of this discussion as to how these wider ranged efforts to meet these emerging challenges can be an outgrowth of new forms of collaboration and cooperation across borders.
Kristen, we've talked sort of in a general sense. You've worked with countries abroad. Could you pick one or two and just say here's what this country's doing, which is actually getting it right, and why they're getting it right, and what contributed to the success? Could you give us an example from something you've observed in either written about or through the direct work of IREX?
Sure. Thank you very much. I want to give credit where credit is due. I think a lot of countries like Finland, like Ukraine that I've mentioned, have been working either in Finland's case for a long time or in Ukraine's case more recently to try and take the issue of disinformation seriously. I do think that we're facing a time where we need to do more and we need to constantly be adapting. So I don't want to let any democracy, even the most sophisticated among us, completely off the hook and say mission accomplished, don't need to worry about this anymore. But I think we can see the examples of what could be built into a more concerted approach, that could be built into a more society-wide approach. And again, I already alluded to what Ukraine is doing, where they are really just integrating these skills into the curriculum. But I do want to say that where I see some shortfalls is looking beyond the schools, because young people don't vote as much as older people. Young people are only a small percentage of the population. Young people, not just in the United States, but in other countries, are less likely to forward disinformation than their older counterparts. And so this is where I think democracies could compare notes, come up with some common strategies. We need data, we need research, we need to know what works, and I'd like to see a lot more collaboration. So while I'm happy to give credit where credit is due, I don't think anybody has cracked the code just yet. Oh, I do want to shout out the United Kingdom. I think the UK has developed some countrywide strategies. I think they have yet to implement them fully, but I think they have taken a very serious look at what it would take to do that. So I think we see glimmers of what success would look like, but I can't say anybody's completely won the war against disinformation.
Thorsten, when you look across Europe and the European Union, my impression is that they have been doing work on this collectively. Is that? But give us a sense. Is there what's going on in broader Europe? We've talked about some specific countries, but is this also being looked at kind of collectively within the European Union? Because that perhaps then could be drawn forward within the wider group of democracies.
I do think there are some efforts in Brussels, in the European External Action Service. There's a little cell that works on disinformation. I think they're really committed and they're doing good work, but they have very limited resources. So we do rely on some of the countries at the forefront of fighting, for example, Russian disinformation in the Baltics, to hear their lesson and to share these lessons Europe-wide. I think it's also when you talk about disinformation, of course, how to then fight it, and how much, what kind of laws and rules you use is also subject to contestation within the European Union. What President Macron, for example, wants to, and so on. Maybe I would personally not sign off on that because I value freedom of expression too much, and we shouldn't err on the side of suppressing speech too much. So I think there is a vital and healthy debate also in terms of the rules and laws that we should pass, and we can learn from not just European countries, but take, for example, on disinformation, also take the example of Taiwan, which has been battling with disinformation in its own democratic process, and from which we could learn.
All right, we're at the 45-minute mark. Kyle, have we got some questions that we can direct to our panel?
Yes, we do. Let me pull them up. There's, I think this one is going to be quite interesting. It's from Twitter. It says, how important is it for democracies to ban Huawei from their 5G network? And what is the view from Europe?
Certainly relevant to Canada. Within the Five Eyes, most of them have, but not us. Why don't I start with Chris and then Kristen, in terms of this whole debate about Huawei, use of Chinese tech firms to provide the kind of framework and skeleton for our next level of communications platforms. Chris?
Well, I think this is central to the overarching debate in the sense that if we don't have confidence about the integrity of these systems that will ultimately serve as a backbone or a big part of the backbone of our communications and technical interaction in open societies, then we have to be very cautious about how we adopt them. And I think what we've discovered, whether it's in the case of Huawei or other such systems coming from the People's Republic of China, in places like Latin America, Sub-Saharan Africa, wider parts of the Americas, is that there are extraordinary vulnerabilities there. And I think the answer to this, again, is for the democracies to have an alternative and high standards that encourage and privilege privacy, transparency, and freedom of expression, and don't bake in or otherwise privilege the sorts of things that will undermine democratic values and democratic accountability.
Kristen, where do you come out on the 5G question? The United States isn't going to be using it. And as I mentioned, the United Kingdom, New Zealand, and Australia. Canada is still making up its mind. What advice would you give a Canadian government?
Well, I think governments, the United States, other democracies have good reasons for not wanting insecure technologies to be used in their systems. That's common sense. It's reasonable for governments to take steps to prevent that from happening. I just want to perhaps against expectations, issue a word of caution. I do think we need to be very clear about what the standards are and why certain individual firms fall within or without those standards. No country will be hurt more than the United States, and certainly other European and countries will be hurt. The Canadian government will be hurt if suddenly there's some sort of blanket trade war or banning of international technology companies. I think we have to be careful about setting off cycles of recrimination where Western technology companies can no longer export to authoritarian countries and vice versa. I think when our companies do work in other countries, they may not do exactly, they may succumb to local laws as they have to, but I think the values baked in are different than they would if they were local companies, Chinese, Russian, and so on. And so I do think we need to be clear about the standards. We need to protect our interests, but I think we also have to be careful we don't set off a chain of events that we actually don't really want to follow through on, because that would be against our interests. It's in our interest to have Western companies that are playing in these spaces continue to be able to export.
But part of that, of course, is you have to have the Western companies, and certainly Huawei in certain areas, there's not really Western companies that are competitively able to compete. Thorsten, I know Europe has taken a sort of different view. That there's a variety of, you seem to be open to, the question that Kyle put about Huawei. Huawei is being used in parts of Europe, but other parts not. Where do you come down on that Huawei debate?
Well, I've been quite active in that debate, and I do think democracies need to exclude high-risk providers such as Huawei and ZTE from their kind of critical technology and communications infrastructure. But that's not because we should be afraid of necessarily of surveillance by the Chinese government because we use Huawei. There's some risks on that front, but that's not the major factor. But the major fear, I think, is just the sheer dependence on technology in critical infrastructure areas. You don't want to be dependent on technology of strategic rivals. That's also what motivates the Chinese government not to be dependent on foreign and especially US technology anymore. So that's something that could be based on reciprocity, and there's sabotage risks, of course, in case of a conflict. So we're well advised to exclude high-risk vendors, Huawei and ZTE, from our critical infrastructure. And I think we also well advised not to fall for the disinformation campaign by some Huawei acolytes among our major Western telcos, such as Deutsche Telekom, that we actually need Huawei technology because there are no alternatives in the Western world. That's simply not true. Nokia, Ericsson, and now also increasingly Samsung, plus some American companies are coming in, and plus some European small and medium-sized, very innovative players. We have all the technology that we need for rolling out secure and top-notch 5G networks within Europe. So we really don't depend on Chinese technology. And the argument that you made, Kristin, I think is quite a slippery slope, because what Chancellor Merkel's push for an open door for Huawei has been mostly motivated by the fear of retribution against German companies on the Chinese market. And I think when it comes to critical infrastructure, we cannot be afraid of retribution, because otherwise we're foregoing our sovereignty and key aspects of our technological sovereignty, and we need to defend that. And it's of course important to do that with clear standards. But I think the standards of not depending on companies that are beholden to authoritarian governments, such as Huawei and ZTE, that's a pretty clear standard. And we can also invite reciprocity. I think it's also ridiculous for Nokia and Ericsson to still expect to be part of the Chinese market. I think we should simply accept that the Chinese government mostly reserves its own market to Chinese providers, and we can rely on our technologies. And so there's perfect reciprocity in this critical infrastructure area.
So Thorsten, would this also involve, if we are going to, in a sense, try and provide an alternative, that's probably going to mean more research and development and investment by governments in some of these big companies. We've done this before on major projects. Would you see that as a piece of this? If we don't have, as Kristen says, we're not sure we've got it, do we then try and create it?
I think we should provide smart incentives for technology companies to be competitive and support our players. Smart industrial policy. I think Germany has become a little more French on that front. We've done it now with batteries, for example, where we weren't there. We need to do it on chips. I think on telecommunications infrastructure, and companies on Nokia, Ericsson, and we need to support the very innovative upstarts we have in Europe and give them chances to roll out and demonstrate their capabilities. And we also need to be aware, I think, the competition, and I think there you also see that there's competition within democracies, and it needs to be healthy competitions, and we shouldn't be naive, because the US government under the banner of Open RAN tries to make up for the lost ground in past decades where American companies fell behind in the global telecoms market, to make sure that now American companies dominate the Western market in 5G and in the future in 6G. And the US is not exactly cautious about this. They actually put their money where their mouth is, and I think they want to make sure that Nokia and Ericsson play less of a role. And I think from a European perspective, we need to make sure that our European companies are competitive in an unfair competition with both Chinese state-backed companies, but also be mindful of the efforts in the US that take also some dubious forms.
Okay, thank you. Kyle, do we have another question?
Yes, we do. We have two questions that are similar. We only have 3 minutes left, so I'm going to read both, and hopefully each of the three fellows can give like 20-second comment on them. But so the first question says, it's from Twitter: authoritarian states manipulate Western tech platforms. What can be done to prevent this? The second one says, this one's from YouTube: should reciprocity be applied by Western democracies in that authoritarian leaders and government officials don't allow social media platforms in their societies, but are allowed to use them in the West to spread disinformation? Should we ban them from these platforms?
Okay. Now, in 20 seconds or less, let me start with you, Chris.
So it's a pretty complicated question to have 20 seconds on, but I think it speaks to the conundrum that has arisen in the modern era, which is everyone can move across borders and these areas of expression pretty seamlessly. I would be reluctant to lowering the boom entirely on these things. I think it's up to democracies to build out the rules that safeguard their information space without becoming the authoritarians themselves.
Good answer. Kristen?
Oh, you're muted, Kristen.
I'll move to you, Thorsten, while Kristen unmutes. Thorsten?
I align with Chris.
Okay, good. Kristen, are we unmuted?
Yes, sorry. When I was on mute, I was saying that I too aligned with Chris. I think it's very well put. And in fighting authoritarian impulses, we don't want to become the very thing we're trying to prevent.
Oh, good response. All right, my final question to you all, and I'm going to start with you, Kristen. What are you reading or streaming these days?
I just finished reading Michael Lewis's The Premonition about people who predicted the pandemic, all the obstacles they found along the way, and how how in free societies, small groups of people can band together to push change. It's both frightening and there's a little bit of heartening aspect to it as well.
All right. Well, anything by Michael Lewis is always worth reading. Thorsten, what are you reading? Or streaming?
I'm reading, not streaming The Crown, but I'm reading a novel by a Georgian-German author called Nino Haratiashvili called The Eighth Life for Grilka, and it tracks the tragic, in a very moving way, it tracks the tragic lives of one Georgian family across the long 20th century and its trials and tribulations, and it's beautifully written, as I said, very tragic and moving, and I can very much recommend this book.
All right, for the summertime reading, but also The Crown is diversion. Chris, what are you reading or streaming?
So it's apropos of our discussion. Really just enjoyed rereading Ron Diebert's book, Reset, where he both dissects the challenges that have emerged in the digital domain in a very thoughtful but candid way. And then, to his great credit, offers some recommendations on how we can address these things.
All right, The Reset, Ron Diebert, Canadian. My wife told me I've got to read it, and now with your recommendation, Chris, I will as well. Well, thank you, Christopher, Thorsten, and Kristen. We were joined today by Kristen Lord, Chris Walker, and Thorsten Benner, sorry, Thorsten. Stay with us for the next panel, and now I'm going to segue back to Kyle and team.
Thank you.
Thank you, Colin, for doing an amazing job at moderating that session. It was one that we could have spent hours on discussing, but didn't have time. But I think it really gave us a lot to reflect on about the idea about Western tech companies and how they must unite. How Western democracies could unite in the tech alliance. So I'd like to now ask our speakers who were on this panel if you could please leave the studio, because we only have place for a few people to come on. So if you look at the bottom of your screen, there's a leave studio button. So if we could thank you, Colin, I don't know, or we could boot you off ourselves. Okay, wonderful. So now we have two members of our next panel, and our moderator is not here yet. So what do we do in such cases? This is the tough thing about Zoom meetings or using these platforms, is that when you do it in place, you can run out and find the person having a coffee. Oh, he's coming just on time. Perfect. All right, John. Great to have you, John. I think you're. If you can turn on your mute button.
I am on.
Oh, wonderful. So this is a really, this panel is a fascinating one, interests me greatly. It's about how can social media be used as a tool to investigate and prosecute atrocity crimes. I remember about 10 years ago, Sarah Sewell at the Carr Center at Harvard put out something called the Marrow Project, and it had something called the Power of Witness, and talked about how new digital technologies could be used in this manner to change people's behavior in conflict zones, and it's really taken off, and we're seeing the UN Office for Prevention of Genocide starting to work on this. We're seeing all sorts of NGOs and think tanks really do some really interesting things. So I think this is going to be a fascinating discussion. I'm going to pass the floor to John Packer, and John is a professor at University of Ottawa, and his Center for Research and Education on Human Rights is one of the partners of this year's Right City Conference. So John, I'd like to pass the floor to you to introduce speakers and carry on the conversation.
Well, thanks a lot for that kind of introduction, and also to the organizers. This is a really fascinating, riveting, so many of the sessions. Today, now we have the sixth principal session and penultimate session in the Right City Conference on social media as a tool to investigate and prosecute atrocity crimes. Yeah, a lot is happening in this field. I have to say, from my own background, I'm speaking to you now from the University of Ottawa, where I'm the Neuberger Jessen Professor of International Conflict Resolution in the Faculty of Law and Director of the Human Rights Center, as you mentioned. But I spent quite a bit of my career, and I started actually, or almost started, investigating my career investigating human rights violations in a number of situations in Iraq, Myanmar, and Afghanistan in the early 1990s. And for those of you who might find it difficult to imagine, in the younger generation, there was no internet at that point. It was just being created actually in Geneva. And there were a lot of these questions, but how investigations were conducted, the means, and some of the old standard gems of evidence and so forth were important. I remember visiting, I'll just say quickly, I remember visiting Myanmar for the first time, I think it was in early 1993, and they had just installed a few satellite discs for telecommunications, but there were a total of 50 hardline telephone lines connecting the entire country. That was the means of at least telecommunication information at that time. So a lot has changed, and what we have now is a really great panel. I can't think of three better people to speak about really on the cutting edge and the state of the art now about investigations using social media, which of course has just been through leaps and bounds growing, and we're going to hear about how that's done, what are some of the issues involved, and try and reflect on how this can be used. Of course, I have to say one of the challenges is we're still facing a lot of problems about venues where this can be pursued. Nonetheless, the panel begins with our first speaker, Nick Waters. I'll introduce the panelists as they speak with their initial presentations. Nick Waters is a senior investigator at Bellingcat, which is itself a product of the development of these telecommunications, and a fascinating group. Nick's background was in the British military before he did some postgraduate studies and began working at Bellingcat. For those who don't know, Bellingcat is an independent international collective of researchers, investigators, and citizen journalists using open source and social media to probe a lot of these subjects. So Nick, we'll listen for your initial remarks.
Cool, thank you very much. And thank you very much for inviting me to speak to you. So I'll kind of start from the most basic principles about why this is so important, or why the subject is so important. So many people around the world today are basically walking around with a tracking device, which can take pictures and videos and then upload it to a network, the internet. And that's a kind of capability that is still relatively new, kind of like 10, 15 years old. And when you combine it with certain human behaviors, it results in a whole new range of information that we have access to. So it's a natural human inclination to want to film the world around us and to take pictures or videos of interesting stuff. And that includes things like, say, conflict or atrocities. If something happens in front of people, say it's a terrorist attack or an airstrike, lots of people will run away, lots of people will hide, but there's always a small group of people who will pull out their phones and take pictures and videos of that event as it takes place. And although to a certain extent people may see this some kind of almost voyeuristic idea, there's a very strong urge to bear witness to the world around us that really comes out in these kind of events, because people will risk their lives to take images and videos and post about events that are affecting them and their community. And because we're humans, we're naturally gregarious, we want to share those experiences that we've experienced with everybody else. These images and videos of those kind of events get posted online, on social media, on closed WhatsApp groups, on multiple different messaging apps, and then eventually emerge on the internet. And a lot of these get posted, say, for example, Twitter or Facebook. And these aren't just social media applications. These are some of the most powerful information networks that humanity has ever created. So I think it's incredibly important that we leverage it in order to investigate these kind of events. And because of these kind of, or because of these images and text posts and videos being posted on social media, for every physical event that takes place, there is a digital ripple. There's a ripple in the digital world as well. And essentially, this is ultimately ephemeral. Videos get deleted, accounts get removed, and I'll talk about that a little bit. But what we have is within Twitter, within Facebook, we have snapshots, moments of memory of specific events, many of which are from people who are specifically asking people external to the situation, say, hey, look at this, this is what is happening to me. And I think it's incredibly important that we can then take that information, which is relevant and can be verified, and use it in justice and accountability settings. And this kind of information is unusual. It is relatively new. But we at Bellingcat have done quite well in terms, I would like to think we've done quite well in terms of taking that information, analyzing it, and showing what can be pulled from it. And we've been working to in different ways to treat that information, analyze it, and preserve it in a way that it could be potentially useful in court as evidence. So a few months ago, we had a mock hearing where we tested the admissibility of one of these videos where we didn't know who had taken it, but we could demonstrate, or we were confident that we could demonstrate that video demonstrated the event in question, or showed the event in question, which is an airstrike in Sana'a in Yemen. And yeah, as I said, like, this information is incredibly important. We're confident and we're working towards a point where it can be used in court. And I think Alex Koenig will speak about that far better than I ever will. And I'll leave you with one last point, which is that if we are going to be using this information, we need to make sure that that's done properly. And we need to understand, how we can actually use it without potentially compromising it as evidence in a justice and accountability setting. Cool. Thank you.
Well, thanks for Nick for that initial kind of entree for all of us into this burgeoning field, and some of the challenges you've already outlined, some of those that I'm sure our next speakers will address. So our second speaker is Stephanie Barber. She's a senior advisor on sexual and gender-based violence at the Commission for International Justice and Accountability, which is an NGO that was created a few years ago, essentially for this kind of work. She's a lawyer, educated in Ireland and the US. Just a word or so on the Commission for International Justice and Accountability, which was founded by Bill Wiley. It's a non-profit, non-governmental entity dedicated to furthering criminal justice efforts through investigations, I would say international criminal justice efforts, in order to prevent the loss and destruction of vital evidence. So that point that Nick was just talking about, for the purposes of supporting prosecutorial efforts and ending impunity, whether at the domestic or international level, but I think most on the international level. Okay, Stephanie, you have the airwaves.
Thank you, John, for the kind introduction, and greetings from Ireland. My organization, the Commission, or CJA, as we call it, carries out the work you just described, and is best known so far for doing so in relation to gathering evidence of war crimes, crimes against humanity, and in some cases, genocide in relation to the regime of Bashar al-Assad in Syria and the reign of Islamic State in northern Iraq and Syria. Our approach has been to gather evidence that might otherwise be lost and preserve it for prosecutions, as you said, but also to prepare case files that examine the leadership structures that perpetrate the crimes, as well as the incidents and the patterns of crime. We are probably best known for doing so through a model of training national investigators who work on the ground to collect battlefield evidence, in particular original documents that help us to analyze the structure and authority of the perpetrating organizations and entities, and to situate individual perpetrators within those structures. To date, we have gathered about 1.3 million documents of internal regime or Islamic State paperwork. We have built multiple case files, and we have been assisting investigators and prosecutors in over a dozen jurisdictions who are building cases. What is perhaps much less known is how we have embraced digital or online evidence gathering as well. And that has ranged from remote extraction of digital material that is still based in the field to physical collection of digital devices and hardware that can later be exploited. To analysis of intercepts, and also, of course, online open source social media investigation, whatever your preferred term is. Syria, as many know, has been dubbed the U2 conflict. And so it's very important that we were able to either integrate these skills into our own skill sets, or to be able to harness the skills of others and specialists where we have needed to build strong cases. To perhaps illustrate how we have integrated digital investigation in our work, I thought I would say a few words about our investigation into the Islamic State slave trade in women and children. which is obviously something that links with my work on sexual and gender-based violence. I believe the example, though, is very illustrative of two main takeaways. The first is how we can use open source material, including, of course, social media, as lead material that can help investigators find cues of what to focus on more deeply. And the second is how this information can be quite high value as corroborative material when it is integrated with a full investigation plan that looks also for documentary evidence, witness testimony, and so forth. Many of you, and I'm sure you, John, will recall how IS attacked the Yazidi people of northern Iraq in the summer of 2014, killing all of the men and adolescent boys who refused to convert to Islam and enslaving over 5,000 women and children, the majority of whom were trafficked into an internal Islamic State slave trade or exploited as child soldiers. In 2015, CIJA commenced ground investigations, but before we did so, we conducted a preliminary analysis based on open source information where we looked for IS publications, fatwas, and other materials that had popped up online about the practice of sabi, as it is called in the Quran, the taking of enemy women and children as spoils of war. And I should note that a lot of these materials would go out on de facto IS channels or pop up on Twitter feeds that would then quickly disappear. But these materials were often reproduced by blogs focused on IS, both pro and not, and mainstream media as well. So they would be disseminated very, very quickly around the net, even if the original source disappeared. We would look at the source analysis to consider whether it might be a legitimate material or not. We would also examine the relevance of the material, its indicated provenance, authenticity issues, and of course, whether it could tell us if there were elements of international criminal law offenses that could be proven using this material. We found, of course, that it was important not to look at a single piece of information that emerged online in isolation, but to consider it as part of a body of material in order to be able to verify the authenticity or note any doubts that we had about that. And of course, we also needed Arabic-speaking Islamic scholar specialists to decipher a lot of that material, because even though it was emerging on one of the most modern tools available, the internet, it's also extremely arcane in its content. That analysis led us to start gathering all of the IS documents, materials on slavery, and treating it as evidence rather than just information, because much of it proved to be very relevant and probative indeed. The substantive analysis showed us that IS was writing down their policies of enslaving Yazidis and sometimes Christians and Shia women as well. And that helped to convince us to proceed with our ground investigation, confident that there would be more documents that we would find in the field. And indeed there were. Our field investigators uncovered decisions of the IS Delegated Committee, the so-called cabinet of the caliphate, as well as orders from IS-run Sharia courts that, implied the transfer of ownership of humans as if they were nothing more than cattle. We, of course, had to put everything through a very strict verification protocol, particularly the online materials, to weed out less trustworthy sources. Some of which more often make the headlines because of the very sensational content, but which we may have doubts about. And as we proceeded with our ground investigation, other online material showed up as well. A video from an IS slave market is quite well known, in which IS fighters talk about how many girls they were going to purchase at a market that day, and that does appear to be genuine. Other materials, such as imagery or claims that have emerged online of the burning alive of victims or the theft of organs, appear to be more dubious, but we examine all of it very closely and subject to these rigorous verification protocols. So eventually, after months of our on-the-ground investigations, interviewing survivors, eyewitnesses, and others, examining original documents and putting that together with the online material, we were able to build a very comprehensive case file that demonstrates the whole modus operandi of a slave trade and the individuals who are responsible for orchestrating it at various levels and locations. So I think that gives you a little flavor of how online investigation techniques can be used both for preliminary analysis and also for helping to corroborate material that can be gathered as part of a wider investigation. I don't know how I'm doing on time. I was going to say a few words about some of the ethical issues that can arise in gathering online material when you're dealing with such sensitive crimes, and the kinds of things we steer away from. But I'm happy to come back to that in the Q&A if there isn't time now.
Why don't we pause that and come back to that, because there are a number of issues, and the ethical one is certainly one of them. So if you don't mind, I suggest that we go on to Dr. Alexa Koenig and hear some elements from her, and then we'll come back to definitely the ethical question. Is that okay with you, Stephanie?
Absolutely.
Okay, so thanks for those initial remarks. And now it's my pleasure to invite our third speaker, Dr. Alexa Koenig, who's the Executive Director of the Human Rights Center at the University of California, Berkeley. She is also a lawyer, a scholar, a practitioner. She's the co-founder of the Human Rights Center Berkeley's Investigations Lab. She's been widely recognized and received a number of awards. For those of you who are less familiar with, for example, the Human Rights Center at the University of Berkeley, it's itself quite renowned, led for, I think, a quarter century now by Eric Stover, who was himself very much involved in investigations in the early 1990s relating to, as part of Physicians for Human Rights, relating to crimes in former Yugoslavia in particular. So there's a pedigree for the center. And I've had the pleasure, Alexa, to work with the center and some of your former colleagues, Lauren Fletcher and others. Outstanding center. So, Dr. Koenig, please share your initial remarks.
Thank you. Thank you so much for that kind introduction. And I'm thrilled to be in conversation with you and with Stephanie and Nick. And this is such a collaborative space, and a space that is growing and changing so quickly that I think it really does depend on people with very different perspectives on this work and bringing that together to make the work as strong as possible. As you just mentioned, we have been around for about 25 years on the Berkeley campus. We are technically based in the School of Law, but we consider ourselves a multidisciplinary center. The advantage of that is really being able to bring together people from practice of law, with journalism, computer science, public health, et cetera, to look at issues of common human rights concern or concern regarding atrocity crimes more broadly. As was mentioned, thinking through how to investigate international crimes is a big part of our DNA. We started off looking at how DNA technology could be used to support these prosecutions going forward. Around 2008, 2009, we began looking also very closely at the emergence of digital technologies and hosted the world's first conference called The Soul of the New Machine on the Berkeley campus to bring together people who are pioneering new documentation methods and taking advantage of the growing availability and lowered cost of access to satellite imagery. As Nick mentioned, the proliferation of the smartphone, the rise of social media, and what that really provided as an opportunity for getting closer to facts on the grounds in ways that complemented the physical evidence that was being collected, the testimonial information, and also, of course, the more traditional forms of documentation that investigators were gathering. A big piece of this in 2011, we were looking at the 10-year anniversary of the International Criminal Court's operations, and we were noticing, like many people around the world, a particular phenomenon taking place, where the judges were increasingly not allowing cases to proceed to next stages of prosecution because they were saying that the prosecution did not have sufficient evidence to allow those cases to continue. And so as a research center, we sent one of our PhD students to the court who spent a summer there, and she came back and said, look, what the judges are ultimately saying is one of the challenges is that the prosecution is over-relying on what was then considered, and is still considered, open source information, but more traditional forms of it, like NGO reports or media stories. And that the judges were saying that's not primary evidence. You really need to bring in additional materials. The second issue that was spotlit was that the judges were saying that the prosecution was over-relying on witness testimony without bringing in the corroborating information that was necessary to meet the legal standards to allow these cases to proceed. So that really launched the last 10 years of our work of thinking through how are new and emerging technologies creating new opportunities for information collection in ways that can be used to support and corroborate what survivors on the ground are saying have taken place and what other forms of evidence have actually indicated has occurred. Today, as John mentioned, we also operate within the larger ambit of the center, the investigations lab. That is something we pulled together in 2016 as we realized the enormous labor and the time that it can take to thoroughly mine online sources for information. And the advantage of being at a 55,000 person campus, it's a very international campus, is that we were able to pull together a team. Each year we have about 60 to 70 students working with us, both at the graduate and undergraduate level, who speak approximately 30 languages and dialects, and who also bring a tremendous amount of methodological experience. So we may have computer science students working alongside law students, et cetera. Today, we do that work through our professional team and the student team. We mine social media for information related to different investigations, and then verify and authenticate that information so that our partners know how reliable that information is moving forward. The three sets of partners with whom we work include groups like investigative reporters and other journalists. We've worked on investigations with the New York Times, Washington Post, Reuters, Associated Press, the most recent being an investigation into alleged crimes in Myanmar for the Associated Press. We also work extensively with human rights organizations. So Amnesty International was our first partner. We also worked with Human Rights Watch, Physicians for Human Rights, and of course, human rights organizations that are located in the sites of conflict or adjacent to them. And then finally, we work with what we broadly call legal partners. So we have worked extensively with UN commissions of inquiry, with different human rights and nonprofit law firms around the world to help complement a lot of the work, the original work and more traditional work that they're doing for evidence collection. Much of our legal work is done under NDA, so we are not very public facing about many of those projects, although we're beginning to release information more publicly when we can share it and when we have permission to do so from those partners. The way that our work really came about in that space was in 2016, we began receiving a lot of calls and emails from lawyers on the ground in sites of conflict like Iraq and Syria, et cetera, or who were working on cases or potentially trying to build cases relating to conflicts there, who were asking, because they knew we were working with digital materials, what kinds of standards and protocols they should be putting in place to ensure the admissibility, to check the probative value, to think about chain of custody with regards to digital online open source information. We did a lot of research with a number of partners in the space and found that there wasn't much formal guidance out there for lawyers, that there was a very ad hoc approach to this globally. It often depended on the judges in different jurisdictions and the technological capacity of those jurisdictions, how this information was being used and introduced. So we realized that there could be a reason to bring some additional standards or guidelines into the space with how prolific the use of online information and online resources was becoming. The amazing work of Bellingcat and others that were bringing much attention to the opportunities to use this kind of material for fact-finding, we realized there might be a need for guidelines. And we hosted a first workshop at the end of 2017 to bring together legal practitioners, investigators, trial attorneys who would need to introduce this information in court, along along with computer scientists, journalists who are pioneering these methods, to talk about what would be helpful. And I think one of the very first things we found was that there wasn't even consistent terminology yet in the space. As many of you know who are lawyers rely on definitions for understanding what they're working with and knowing its potential utility. So we began putting together some definitions that we thought could bring some structure to the field. For example, open source evidence was being talked about quite broadly by journalists and others, really to mean generally information that supported your points, as opposed to the more formal definitions that you see in courts of law, where evidence has a very distinct meaning. And so we tried to bring some conceptual clarity to that. We began the work once we heard that there was a demand for additional resources and support. We brought on Lindsay Freeman, who's now a member of our team, to begin drafting an international protocol or set of guidelines in partnership with the United Nations Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights. The process was very collaborative. We did more than 150 consultations with practitioners, government experts, et cetera, around the globe around what standards and processes they were currently using. We hosted a series of workshops to get at some of the stickier issues where there were a lot of questions, like around the use of false identities and investigation, particularly when you are not law enforcement, thinking through some of the ethics. We were also seeing some really challenging issues, particularly as Stephanie mentioned, on sexual violence related investigations. And then we tested out portions of the protocol throughout its development against real world investigations. So Lindsay was based at the International Criminal Court and had a chance to test different portions of the protocol against those investigations. And meanwhile, we were testing portions as well within our investigations team. We're usually running approximately about a dozen investigations at any given time. So finally, this past December, we launched the Berkeley Protocol on Digital Open Source Investigations in an advanced English version with the United Nations. We will be releasing the formal version this summer, along with a version of it in every language of the UN. And we also have a few organizations that have offered to translate the protocol into additional languages. And I know I'm running short on time, so I'll just quickly say, I think what we were hoping for with this set of guidelines was to establish a floor, a minimum set of practices, so that people who are working on these spaces or looking to incorporate online open source investigations into their daily practice would have some understanding of where to start. However, because it sets minimum standards and not necessarily best practices, and because it's largely tool agnostic, meaning we don't mention specific tools you can do to do this work because they change so quickly in digital practice, we made it tool agnostic. So organizations do still need to develop SOPs or standard operating practices for incorporating these methodologies. We helped the ICC and have helped others to develop those SOPs. And now I think are looking at developing additional research that can help complement some of what we have in the protocol. We have a special issue, which I might get a chance to talk about later, in the Journal of International Criminal Justice coming up, where Nick has a piece on how to work with these methodologies. I have a couple of pieces coming out on using open source information for investigating sexual and gender-based violence-related crimes, one there, and in a book chapter, which I actually think provides some practical suggestions for how we can strengthen that. And I think with that, since I'm out of time, I will leave it there and look forward to the conversation. Thank you.
Thanks, Alexa. Okay, so we've got a lot on the table here, and we've got less than 30 minutes. And I think this range and speed of kind of developments and all that's been happening is difficult for many people to digest. So I suggest we organize a little bit our conversation now into focusing a bit on still the kind of what and how, what exactly this is and how it works. Then we can talk about some of the issues like the ethical questions and so forth, which are perhaps not necessarily so new, but are interesting and important in their manifestations. So on the what and how, Alexa, you already mentioned this kind of question about open source, which is itself a product of kind of new information age. What does that mean actually? And perhaps Nick, you can just explain to us the distinctions in terms of the sources. I think Stephanie already referred to kind of provenance and so forth, like where this information is coming from and what are the distinctions. And let me just also for viewers note that we've already heard a couple words here that are reference to evidence, kind of evidence. So we are speaking in the broad terms of prosecution, meaning criminal processes and criminal accountability or culpability of individuals. So I'm going to leave aside here for our purpose of our session the use of all of this with regard to state responsibility. So for people who are thinking about what about China and the Uyghurs, yeah, that's an issue. And what's going on in Xinjiang, absolutely. But of course, we don't prosecute a state, and the significance of of evidence and so forth in terms of state responsibility is different. So if we're focusing here on individual culpability, and I'll just remind those of you who or inform those who don't know, generally evidence from a legal perspective has three forms: physical, a shooting, a smoking gun, or a dead body. The documentary, and there was quite a bit of discussion there. Stephanie was mentioning about the collection of documents and original documents, and then testimony. And it's these kind of interplay of these three, and particularly their corroboration, the triangulation, and so forth that's relevant. So, Nick, can you tell us a bit about what is it we're talking about in terms of the sources of information, and particularly open source, and the distinctions in this?
Yeah, so some of the people listening or watching may be familiar with the term OSINT, open source intelligence. It's a term that I don't really like using anymore because we don't view ourselves as creating intelligence. However, that's where the kind of original open source idea comes from. And the definition that we use is that it is any information that is available generally online, but it can be down your local library, for example, which you may have to pay a little bit of money for, but you do not have to be part of any particular group of people. You don't have to have any kind of specific security clearance. So anyone can access it, even if you have to pay a little bit of money for it. In reality, there are a few major buckets that we at Bellingcat have been using over the last few years to pretty consistently. And that generally is UGC. So that is user-generated content. So those are the images, the videos, the posts that I was talking about earlier, that depict events or talk about events. We also use a huge amount of traditional media, because frequently they will be able to have, stringers on the ground or cameras on the ground as well, which are taking high quality professional footage. They may not necessarily understand what they're actually capturing though. And we also use a huge amount of satellite imagery as well. So not just your kind of Google Maps and Google Earth, but also, the high quality or more frequent commercial satellite imagery that generally you have to pay for, because that can be an incredibly powerful tool, especially if you're investigating something like an airstrike, which will leave those kind of physical marks visible and will allow you to demonstrate what has happened. But sometimes they've kind of switched into a slightly kind of weirder source of information. So, for example, with our investigations looking at Russian assassinations, we have moved less from open source and more into what are effectively a criminal digital marketplace, where information from that has been effectively obtained by people within Russia or civil servants within Russia is then sold. You can use that to investigate those Russian assassinations that we talked about. And actually, that, interesting enough, I thought that kind of stuff could not be used as evidence, but it looks potentially likely it could. And sometimes you get even weirder stuff. For example, you'll find some aspect of Twitter where someone is an expert on the fingertips of distant celebrities or something like that, kind of all kinds of weird stuff. But essentially, it's a definition that I provided.
Can you just add a word? I mean, so for neophytes like me, we hear words like the dark web and so forth. And you were just mentioning criminal gang communication. So can you just say a word or two about not only what all that encompasses and its utility?
Yeah, so there's essentially it's the part of the internet that's indexed by Google, the deep web, which is a part of the normal internet that is not indexed by Google, and the dark web, which runs on the Onion protocol, hence the Tor network, the Onion protocol, or the Onion router tool. Honestly, the vast majority of the information that we obtain is not on the dark web. Not so much of it is from the deep web. The vast majority of what we use is on Twitter, on Facebook, on the surface web. With the Russian investigations, you do have to access dark web marketplaces. And in my previous work as doing cyber threat intelligence for Digital Shadows commercial company, we would access that in order to find like insider threats to companies. But for the majority of the kind of investigations that we've done and that we're probably talking about here, honestly, the dark web is not so prominent, although it is used by certain terrorist groups in order to get across their information. Although actually primarily they use would be more like the deep web, so like Telegram messaging apps, for example.
So that there's actually an enormous amount of information, right? I mean, in the early days of kind of human rights investigations, that was the big problem. If only we knew, if only, that's the origin of creating special rapporteurs who would be the ones who would go and collect that information. Alexa, perhaps before we turn to the ethics of it, the kind of utility elements of this. So, you know, a classic problem of any information, particularly evidence for prosecutorial purposes, is a question of veracity. So not only who it comes from, but what's its quality in terms of evidence? Is it reliable? Has it been, compromised? They say, so doctored or affected and so forth. Can you say something about, you know, how to address this essential question in terms of this subject?
Sure, I'd be happy to. So I think part of what we struggled with the protocol was how to help establish different ways to make sure that the information you are collecting, given the ephemerality that Nick mentioned earlier of this information, that you have the content you need, that it's not disappearing from online spaces, that you're able to grab it and preserve it, documenting some form of chain of custody in ways that are helpful to downstream uses, and that you have a way to verify the information that is methodical so that you have a strong degree of reliability in it. One of the research studies that I've been working on with two colleagues, Yvonne McDermott-Rees and Dara Murray, has been looking at the issues of bias that can come in along every kind of link in the chain of getting this information into court. So bias in terms of who has access to the internet and can get accurate information up in the first place, and then bias in what we find and are able to locate in online spaces, given the methodologies we use, and then of course bias in interpretation and analysis. And to minimize the risks in that third bucket, I think one of the things that we recommend in the protocol is really going through consistently a 3-step process of verification for every piece of digital content. So the first would be to look at any technical data that is still attached to the piece of information that you are hoping to use, whether it's a video or a photograph that's been shared with you over WhatsApp or that you've downloaded from Twitter or Facebook, etc. So often you'd be looking at whether there's any, the metadata or EXIF data is still attached to that photo or video. That is information that the device capturing that image or video would imprint ideally on the piece of information about what kind of device captured it, what the date might have been, what the coordinates were. If it's present, that is not always reliable. It can be manipulated, but it can be a first clue to later stages of the verification process. The challenge, as anyone working in this space knows, is that most social media sites and most programs will strip the metadata from any piece of item that's shared. And that's largely for privacy purposes, so that people aren't inadvertently leaking more information about their location and their identity than they may choose to. So if there is no metadata, and actually in addition to if there is, because you still need to confirm whether that's accurate, is you would go on to a next stage of considering the source of the information and the reliability of that source for the type of information that you have in front of you. So that could be anything from, if you got this from someone's Twitter post, like Twitter feed, are they someone who is consistent, and it's supposedly from Syria, are they someone who's been consistently tweeting about Syrian events for quite some time? Or are they a group that seems to really hopscotch around, and therefore the reliability of the information they're sharing may be lesser because they may not actually have primary information? You also want to make sure that they are the original source of the video or the photograph, and this isn't something that's been recycled or recontextualized and potentially miscontextualized as it's circulated in these digital spaces. And the third bucket is really doing what we would call content analysis, which is to see if what you can see within the four corners of your video or photograph are consistent with what you've been told about it. So if you are told that this video is documenting a chemical weapons attack at a particular location in Syria, how do you know whether this is Syria or not? Can you find indicators in that particular visual image that are consistent with what you can see on satellite imagery, what you've been told about it by witnesses, etc., and basically pull all of that together to triangulate this information? I think increasingly, and then I'll of course stop, one big challenge is something that you just mentioned, which is the finding the needle in the haystack. Given the extraordinary volume of information that's out there in digital space, I think just on Twitter, we're seeing something like 6,000 tweets created every second. So finding the information that's relevant and that has probative value can be quite tricky. I think one thing we're beginning to see is, of course, the scraping of these sites, so the mass collection of information that may be relevant, and then the increasing automation of how to comb through that information efficiently with machines. So because sometimes the volume will kind of exceed human review capabilities. I think one challenge is that there are a lot of great technologies being developed on object recognition to help, for example, identify certain kinds of weapons or planes or buildings, et cetera. One of the challenges we're seeing is how, if automation becomes an increasing part of these methodologies, how we ensure that crimes like the ones that Stephanie talks about in terms of sexual and gender-based violence, how those don't get lost and overlooked as we increasingly automate the process. One of the things that we've really been talking about are some of the strategies of also relying on things like natural language processing and ensuring that those come in as complements to be able to detect the ways that people talk about stigmatized crimes, to make sure you're just not missing an entire bucket of content that could be really critical to ensuring that what you have, the facts in front of you, and what you think they say about what has happened on the ground is in fact helpful.
So there's what I hear is a lot of the kind of classic questions remain, but their manifestation now in terms of, for example, volume, speed. So they bring with them both amazing reach through social media and sort of real-time information flows and so forth, but big challenges that accompany them. I had the pleasure of meeting the famous Dr. Clyde Snow in the early 1990s, a forensic anthropologist, really working with the old methods, mass graves and things like that. And a lot of the same questions remain. But is there, and Stephanie, I want to come back now to the ethical elements here. Alexa just mentioned one with regard to sexual and gender-based crimes, but more broadly, privacy. I think Alexa also mentioned privacy. Can you tell us something about how social media here not only presents the same old problems of ethics, but perhaps exacerbates or creates new ones?
Sure. I mean, the privacy challenge, it's one I spent just yesterday scratching my head about with a group of other experts. It's not just a matter of the ethical issues. There are also just proliferating legal frameworks, both from the EU dimension, the GDPR, and other directives that cover law enforcement to the national level, and then the transatlantic element. So it really becomes quite a minefield, and many questions abound about whose privacy is being considered as well. Is it that of the alleged suspect or perpetrator? Is it the witnesses and the victims and all of the potential protection issues that creates? Is it those involved in creating the user-generated content, or the citizen journalists, or the investigators themselves? So it really can be incredibly complex, but as you kind of indicated, we have to fall back on some of the old ways as well and assess on a case-by-case basis. What are we dealing with? What are the implications? What are the governing legal frameworks and standards that we are meant to work to, and go from there? But I think, the boundary, the cliff edge that we're still on is how will a judge react to something when it's brought before them? And when we look at the jurisprudence from international criminal tribunals, it's really quite diverse, and we've seen different approaches emerge, and the contours of practice and law around this are constantly evolving and changing as the materials that we bring before judges are evolving and changing. And so it's very difficult to predict what the reactions will be. Maybe just to link that back to the issue of sexual and gender-based violence and bringing forward evidence in relation to that, I think one of the concerns is that we don't create so much interest and attention and focus on digital evidence that we unintentionally push out focus on crimes for which that evidence may not exist, because rape, for example, would be one of the crimes that classically occurs in a private space and away from the eyes of other witnesses and cameras, etc. Even in the context of conflicts where it's happening in a widespread and systematic way, it can still often be very hidden from visual and documentable forms of digital evidence. But I think, as I described earlier, there are other ways in which online evidence can support these kind of investigations. And we have to think more broadly than imagery, than video, because in a way, nearly every type of evidence can have its digital manifestation these days, and can be involved even in the investigation of these kind of intimate sexual crimes as well.
John,
I mean, can I ask in terms of the ethical issue of consent? So when I used to investigate in person on the ground international human rights violations, serious human rights violations, and taking testimony, for example, or collecting documentation and so forth, there is a serious question about consent and the expectation of persons to give that consent with the expectation that something will follow from it. I mean, I'm struck by the recent confirmation of General Mladic's criminal culpability a full quarter century after the events occurred. And I wonder, just as you just mentioned, in the case of, a victim of rape, if one says, well, share this information, very delicate, very prejudicial socially, and something might happen in a quarter century. How does one navigate this kind of, I would say, dilemma? I'm also curious, Nick, how in terms of just where you don't have consent, but you have access, what is the position on the ethics of this?
Who should go first, though? Myself, Stephanie. I'm going to assume that's...
Yeah, Stephanie, if you could start, and then Nick, you can...
Yeah, no, I think it's a very pertinent question. I mean, again, we may not be talking about asking a victim to consent to reliance as evidence on a video or audio file that depicts actual sexual violence. Very rarely do we have it. And I think most investigators, certainly myself, would balk at using it because of the very real protection and well-being concerns that would raise for victims or survivors. But for example, there could be other types of material, such as in the case of Islamic State, they have often produced and sent out ransom videos, ransom photographs for enslaved women and children that they are trying to sell back to their families and their communities. And we sometimes receive those. And that is, of course, very interesting lead material for us, but it's also material that depicts victims and survivors, if they do in fact survive, in really vulnerable circumstances, and we would not use it as evidence for that reason and for all of the protection concerns that arise around it. And it's important to remember that so much work has been done in the field of sexual and gender-based violence, not to place additional evidentiary burdens on proving those crimes, but actually to lessen those burdens. And so therefore at the ICC and other international courts and tribunals, there is no obligation to corroborate the testimony of a survivor or other evidence of sexual violence. And that's a gain that we don't want to lose just because there might now also be digital evidence, and particularly when there's ethical issues around that. So again, I think it comes back to we must evaluate on a case-by-case basis and use all of our investigative analytical skill set when we look at a piece of evidence and consider how we might use it.
So Nick, what does Bellingcat what position does Bellingcat have on this, or what do you do?
Yeah, so it's quite, it's a little bit more complex than I think most people would think about or would consider. Like the kind of initial point that we work from is that if someone's posted this, or if an image or video has been posted online in the open, then we're allowed to use that. That's our base point at which we start. However, the considerations that we take into account when we use it may change. Because if someone posts an image or a video online on their small account that has 30 followers, and they don't believe it's going to be picked up by like a large organization, say for example New York Times or Bellingcat, they may not expect or like the fact that it has been. So that should certainly be taken into account when doing this kind of research. And I think if you believe that someone is the original author of a piece of content, an image or a video, then all reasonable routes should be taken to get in contact with them and ask if it's possible to use that. However, the majority of the content that you see online, the majority of the images and videos that you see, primarily videos that you see, it's not possible to establish who originally filmed them. What generally happens is that an image or a video may be taken, it will be posted within, say, a person's immediate network, then that will get posted on WhatsApp groups, Telegram groups, private groups, and then it'll start getting posted on Twitter or Facebook. So by the time it reaches an investigator, it will have gone through multiple different iterations and will be virtually impossible to establish who actually took that image or that video. And at that point, you're in a bit of an ethical quandary because you have no idea who actually filmed this stuff. And I stress again, this is the majority of user-generated content that I've come across. Do you simply not use it because you cannot establish who actually originally created that content? Especially if it shows something that is incredibly important. So, for example, the fact that an airstrike took place at a particular location, or potentially an execution. And for me, that question is pretty clear. Yes, I think it is possible. Indeed, I know it is possible to use, and I think it is ethical to do so, because I think on the balance of public interest, you should use that content in order to show what happened, even if it's not possible to establish precisely who took that image or video. Generally, that I refer to that in the context of conflict and trust issues within conflict. However, within other situations, it can be more complex. And there are certainly things that you can do in order to mitigate the potential impact of using those kind of images. So, for example, blurring faces, obscuring names, that kind of stuff. But yes, it's still kind of complex and still kind of a case-by-case issue that we deal with at Bellingcat.
No, those sound like important steps, and everything can be done to mitigate and balance the public interest and so forth. Alexa, so the guidelines that were established, is there a solution in these, at least from a point of view of principle? And then, as our time is short, in addition to that question, the ethical question, what Nick was just talking about, the use of this. So can you comment, and we've had some people interested in, so what would one do? How can one use this in, let's say, a real existing real-time situation like Tigray in northern Ethiopia?
So one of the things that we are currently working on at the center and hope to be able to release some preliminary findings on soon is directly to this issue of consent. So we're creating an entire typology of what are the many ways in which the issue of consent arises in a digital open source investigation. And it turns out there are so many different areas where that comes up that it really would be more than I'd have time to fully and thoroughly address in the next minute or so. But I do want to put a pin in the fact that that is coming, and it is a very detailed analysis that brings in the law related to this, along with what we're seeing in terms of practice. As Nick mentioned, it's often information is often being handled by intermediaries. And I think even when it's going directly to investigators, knowing what the intermediary has said to the person who maybe produced the information is a big, tricky piece of this. I think it's further complicated in the sexual and gender-based violence context. If we think about rape, that is often partially defined as having had a lack of consent to the activity or to the crime that's been perpetrated. And so I think there's an additional sensitivity that comes up when investigating SGBV-related crimes around not wanting to further remove consent from the victim or survivor. What we have come up with is a three-pronged ethics framework that we use for our own internal operations. And essentially, we start off by going, what are the legal requirements for how I handle this information? Second, what does my professional code of ethics say about how I can handle this information? And that differs across our team based on whether we're a lawyer or a journalist. And finally, what are the emerging OSINT norms and OSINT ethics say about this? On the last prong, we also have a three-part framework that we go through very methodically on each of these use cases, looking at the security issues that are implicated by use, and that's considered physical, digital, and psychological security for the survivor, for the investigator, and for others. The second part being the dignity aspects of it, the human rights issues that are implicated by its use, and the third being the accuracy of the information that's being used and the quality of that information. And so anyone who wants more on those pieces, I'm always, of course, happy to share. And we also do trainings on thinking through the ethics piece. Finally, we've done this major study on sexual and gender-based violence and the use of open source investigations, interviewing traditional investigators, OSINT investigators, and then gender experts. And I think we have a lot of suggestions on improving the ethics around the handling of this kind of information in sexual violence investigations, including working with gender experts, that a lot of their knowledge and insights can be brought into the online investigation process.
Well, thanks. That sounds great. That sounds like a great framework and all. And I'm looking forward to seeing what you'll come up with shortly in terms of the publication. Unfortunately, our time we've reached the limit, and I very much feel that we've barely scratched the surface of this burgeoning field and important field. I think, Kyle, perhaps you can guide us now on what our next steps are for the end of the day, because then I think tomorrow is the last day.
Yeah. So I'd just like to thank everyone. John, you did a wonderful job moderating. We're going to get you, but you came in right when we started, so fantastic. Alexa, Nick, and Stephanie, thank you for sharing your knowledge, your expertise. You're all doing such important work. We're hopefully, this is an annual conference. First time we've done it virtual, but hopefully we'll be able to have you in Canada sometime in the future to discuss this in person, but also in more informal settings as the conferences that we used to have. So, but we're really, really, really pleased to have you, and your work inspires us here in Montreal and across Canada, and we're hoping that this will lead to collaboration. Just one last note, we have one last panel taking place tomorrow. If anyone's interested, please join in at 12 o'clock Eastern Standard Time. It's a panel on confronting online hate, and we're gonna have representatives of the United Nations, Facebook, and from different academic institutions, and the Global Action Against Mass Atrocity Crimes Initiative. So with that being said, thank you for joining us. Thank you, and please join us tomorrow.